In Venezuela, everyday life is marked by uncertainty, political, economic, and social crisis. The everyday became increasingly difficult, and the entire population lives under a regime that gradually stripped away every aspect of what constitutes people's quality of life. But that is about to change, because the lies became so evident that even those deceived by the lie of a revolution that only improved the lives of the leaders now dare to seek a change. The Venezuelan community is days away from realizing the possibility of beginning to reverse a quarter-century of impoverishment. The case of Venezuela can well be compared to the so-called boiling frog syndrome. Nicolás Maduro has been in power since 2013, when he was named as the natural heir and successor to Hugo Chávez, who assumed the presidency of the country in 1999, initiating the Bolivarian Revolution. Both leaders managed to concentrate so much power that they ended up convincing citizens to follow and accompany them without telling them where they were leading. They began by occupying democratic institutions, later limiting civil liberties, and finally managed to modify the constitution to suit their own need for re-election and continuity. The boiling frog analogy is used to describe what happens when a problem develops so slowly that its damages are not easily perceived immediately. Year after year, authoritarianism in Venezuela intensified, but the population was contained with strong ideological indoctrination, a manipulated narrative of a revolutionary and patriotic epic, and an economic policy marked by strong social assistance that made citizens increasingly dependent on the state. If a frog submerged in a pot of warm water slowly raises the water temperature, it is said that it will not realize the danger it is in until it is too late and ends up boiling to death. Normalizing the situation and getting used to it prevents timely reaction, but if you try to put the frog in the pot when the water is already boiling, it will jump instantly as a reflex action to escape the situation and save itself. No one sees Venezuela as a destination to live in anymore. On the contrary, the huge exodus of Venezuelans demonstrated that the pot was already too hot to stay and endure an oppressive government that makes life worse every day. The upcoming elections represent a crucial opportunity to achieve a change in the country's direction. Venezuelans have become aware that while they became impoverished, their politicians became increasingly wealthy, and they are no longer willing to accept more deception or bribes to entrust another term to those who ultimately are responsible for leaving them in the situation they are in. And it would be good to take a moment to analyze a graphic image of Venezuela's reality. We invite you to pay special attention to this pyramid containing data on Venezuela's population by age. The pyramid shows an estimated population for the year 2024 of just over 29 million inhabitants throughout the country, according to projection data from the populationpyramid.net website. If we consider that from the age of 10, people have a certain political memory, we can observe that those aged 35 or younger do not know anything other than Chavismo, and their lives have been marked by this regime that continues to this day. These generations know nothing but the suffocating cultural, ideological, and doctrinal atmosphere of a government regime that invaded everything and became a country with widespread poverty, which was considered normal and part of a naturalized reality. But Venezuelans under 35 today represent 57.23% of the population, more than half, and despite only knowing this reality, having grown up receiving constant indoctrination, they no longer want to continue with this macabre Bolivarian experiment. On July 28, 2024, they will be able to decide whether to continue with Maduro's government or opt for an alternative that allows them to restore democracy and stability. And it's a unique opportunity. Many Venezuelans who were initially supporters of Chávez have followed his instructions by voting for Maduro at his explicit request before his death, and are now discovering only now that the Bolivarian Revolution was not a plan for the people, but only for its leaders, who became enriched through corruption. The Bolibourgeoisie, hiding behind the regime and living at the expense of the hunger of the rest of the population. But every attempt to confront the regime in elections has always been neutralized with different maneuvers by the government. Possible candidates were always defeated by a manipulative web of legal traps that prevented them from competing in elections, and when they managed to get there, the government committed fraud in the vote count and remained in power. This generated demotivation and distrust among the population, which has already seen many candidates work for a change that ultimately fails to materialize and thus lost interest in going to vote. And when people don't go to vote, electoral authorities record a vote for the regime on the absentee ballot. However, amidst so much hopelessness, there were people who were not afraid to express a voice that could rise against so many injustices, and thus, the prominent figure of María Corina Machado began to emerge, who, despite being disqualified by Chávez himself, knew how to demonstrate that she is not afraid and that she speaks the truth. calling things by their name. Private property is a right that should not be violated, and those who do so are stealing.
Esto es lo que queríamos escuchar, la Venezuela decente y la que no quiere definitivamente avanzar hacia el comunismo. Quiere respeto a la propiedad y queremos una Venezuela de solidaridad, una Venezuela de justicia, una Venezuela de superación.
Por favor.
¿Cómo puede usted hablar de que respeta al sector privado en Venezuela cuando se ha dedicado a expropiar, que es robar? Cuando se ha dedicado a insultar, sí, las propiedades de empresarios, comerciantes, hasta pequeños posadas a quienes ni siquiera se le han resarcido su propiedad. Dígale la verdad a Venezuela. Aquí hay una Venezuela decente que quiere una transformación profunda y que es el momento de enfrentar con seriedad y con responsabilidad este desafío histórico que tenemos por delante. El tiempo se les acabó. Es el momento de una nueva Venezuela. Sí, acepte el debate, presidente.
Bien. Yo primero le sugiero que gane las primarias, ¿verdad? Gane usted las primarias. Es lo primero que tiene que hacer, porque está fuera de ranking para debatir conmigo.
María Corina built her leadership based on a personality that expresses an uncomfortable truth, but it was also this trait that allowed many Venezuelans not only to discover that there are other options besides a socialist government that impoverishes the population, but also that it is possible to confront a regime leading a supposed revolution so sterile that it no longer corresponds to the reality of a world integrated into global trade. The winds of change are blowing in Latin America, and figures like Javier Milei in Argentina or Nayib Bukele in El Salvador are demonstrating that the continuity of an entrenched political model can be broken if it receives real support from the people. The awareness of the situation and the change in attitude of the majority of the population led them to begin seeking genuine political alternatives to escape the dire situation they were in. Above all, there was still a part of the population that had believed in Hugo Chávez and took too long to understand that with Nicolás Maduro, they are heading towards the precipice and absolute misery. These processes gradually took place until the preference for María Corina became so great that it allowed her to sweep the primaries of October 2023 with 92% of the votes. This situation of massive voter turnout and the almost unanimous decision of the voters to agree on a single political figure that allows them to escape the poverty in which they find themselves made them see how many they are and the coincidence of criteria. The power of many to overthrow a few was so evident that the government decided to annul the election results and disqualify María Corina Machado as a candidate. But María Corina Machado, with her results in the primaries, managed to demonstrate to Venezuela and the world that the electoral base that Chavismo had is no longer there, and those votes are irrecoverable for the government. The entire Venezuelan population wants a change, and that change is liberal. They are tired of this 21st century socialism. Despite the censorship of the independent press, the persecution of opponents, and all kinds of obstacles imposed by the government on anyone it considers to be against what the regime authorizes, people began to share information through social networks, bypassing the closure of international media and radios in the interior. Communication from individual devices replaced government propaganda channels, and the population shares information and manages to overcome the government's constant political intimidation. Channels like ours set records for shares on social networks, and our statistics show how all of Latin America is viralizing what is happening in Venezuela. Our videos are shared via WhatsApp, allowing us to see that all Venezuelans, especially those abroad, post in the Facebook groups of each country and are building a communication network that surpasses censorship and transcends borders, reaching the entire region that has already observed the huge exodus of Venezuelans and sympathizes with the sad situation so many families suffer because of this narco-state that seized power and refuses to leave. Venezuelans have become so accustomed to the electoral manipulations of the government that all parties of the true opposition met and unanimously designated Edmundo González Urrutia as their presidential candidate. The former ambassador and now presidential candidate had been provisionally nominated by the Democratic Unity Table Party amid the obstructions of the candidacies of María Corina Machado and Corina Lloris. Thus, the opposition managed to circumvent the complex web of censorship and traps set by the government to finally have their own approved card, an enabled candidate, and an election date in which to compete. In that joint meeting of the entire opposition to the government, not only was support for the candidate reaffirmed, but other candidacies were even withdrawn to eliminate the risk of vote dispersion, sealing the final alliance to overcome tyranny on its own rigged ground. This time, as María Corina Machado says, it will be to the end. In the final days of the campaign, María Corina is holding increasingly massive events, and citizen mobilization is increasingly responding to the calls, exposing that victory is becoming an increasingly palpable possibility. However, it is very important to continue with international denunciation of the abuses that Maduro is committing by continuing to persecute and imprison opponents with the evident intention of intimidating the people. Peaceful, civilized resistance with a lot of action on social networks is allowing them to gather more and more strength to win the electoral challenge and defend the manipulated democracy from the permanent authoritarian threat. Sharing information, going viral, and making known everything that helps generate the change that everyone wants in Venezuela is the best campaign strategy and dissemination of new ideas so clouded by so many years of Chavista propaganda and mediocre indoctrination. Election day will be a pivotal point as the regime will try by all means to prevent people from going to vote and will resort to all the old Chavista tricks of making all absentees vote for Maduro, restricting the access of expatriates to embassies, and if all else fails, committing fraud at the final moment of vote counting, trying to falsify the results to continue the farce that they are a government elected by the majority. The criminal narco-state ruling Venezuela has no scruples, and as we anticipated in another previous report, it is not so simple for a dictator like Nicolás Maduro to hand over power and acknowledge defeat. Therefore, it is very important that all citizens eligible to vote show up to reduce the space for fraud, which undoubtedly they will attempt from the state apparatus. It is very true that there are many obstacles, but despite the censorship of the media, social networks are showing how government events only have party militants bust in exchange for fuel, and even then they are very small, and the photos and videos they publish show close-ups to avoid showing the lack of people. Meanwhile, the rallies organized by María Corina are increasingly numerous and reinforce the determination to fight for freedom and justice under legitimate and democratic leadership. It has been 25 years since Venezuela has seen the awakening of a new collective consciousness with a project that offers hope and a renewed commitment to building a country where fundamental rights are respected and economic development is promoted. For 25 years, ideology took the country out of the debate on what is best for Venezuelans, and a narrative of anti-imperialist struggle imposed by Cuba was established, leading to a marginal position in trade relations and links with the world, having relations only with Russia, Iran, Cuba, and countries under left-wing governments that did not understand the evolution of the world, international relations, and only raised conflicts that justified their position. There is no doubt that Nicolás Maduro's regime will receive a very harsh and decisive blow in the elections. The most conservative estimates estimate that Edmundo González Urrutia would win with 70% of the votes. The doubt is rather whether the regime will be able to fulfill its part and hand over power to the winner. In a previous report, we already warned that Maduro's options are the same as those of a cornered kidnapper, as these days he has not stopped negotiating options to ensure he does not go to jail. He doesn't have many options, and undoubtedly the ones he has are not the best for Venezuela, as detailed in our previous report. María Corina Machado corners Maduro to his worst options. In that report, it is expressed that one of Maduro's alternatives is to leave the country before handing over power, and it is already visualized that it is correct according to the latest statements of the dictator who, understanding the situation, begins to think about his retirement. Maduro doesn't have many options to leave. He could only travel to Cuba, where the Cuban government will surely also fall in the next election, or to Iran, for which he held a meeting in Miraflores with Ayatollah Reza Ramazania, Secretary General of the Al-Ul Bayt World Assembly, and it is said that Tarek el-Aissami was taken on the return flight, or to China, where he sent his son Nicolásito Maduro Guerra on a mission of dubious agenda, or the last option would be to hide in Russia, where he already confirmed he has pending travel. Maduro cannot embark on trips to any part of the world because he runs the risk of being arrested in most destinations and could only travel on private flights while he holds power, so it is highly likely that, upon losing the elections and before the transfer of power date, he will flee from Venezuela, arguing that his life is in danger. A new Venezuela is possible, one where the voice of the people is heard and the fundamental rights of all citizens are respected, with leaders committed to progress and without political persecution. Latin America is changing in a positive evolution where its leaders work in the service of the people and not the other way around. The true power lies in responsible voting. For a clearer example, let's listen to what candidate Javier Milei said before winning the presidency of Argentina, because the solution in this pendulum-like Latin America will surely come from the liberals.
A ver, yo creo que el gran problema argentino es un problema cultural. Es decir, esta es una sociedad que está infectada de socialismo. Y lo que hay que lograr es sacar el socialismo de la cabeza de la gente, ¿sí? Y los principales promotores de estas ideas son los políticos, porque los liberales somos los únicos que le enrostramos a los políticos que ellos no son la solución, que ellos son el problema. Los políticos son una suerte de sociópatas que quieren hacernos creer que nosotros somos inválidos mentales, inválidos en todo sentido, porque no podemos vivir si no fuera por ellos. En realidad los que no pueden vivir sin nosotros son ellos. Es decir, si el país se separara entre los que producimos de un lado y del otro lado queda la mierda de los políticos, los sindicalistas, todo este conjunto de parásitos se hunden, se mueren. Separemos la Argentina, en Argentina del Norte y Argentina del Sur, ¿sabes qué? Los que estamos dispuestos a laburar nos vamos a la parte más pobre del país, le dejamos vaca muerta, todo. Aun cuando se quedaran con todo, se van a hundir estas ratas porque no sirven para nada. En cambio, los que laburamos y sabemos ganarnos la vida, ¿sabes qué? Nos va a ir bien. Nosotros somos gente de bien, gente que labura y no vivimos abogando por la envidia, el odio, el resentimiento, el robo, sí, el trato desigual frente a la ley, que es esa inmundicia de la justicia social, que es lo más injusto que existe, porque implica robarle a una persona el fruto de su trabajo para dárselo a quien a mí se me da la gana. Pero ¿de dónde salieron esta manga de sátrapa? ¿Sabes por qué? Porque además en todo ese proceso, no solo que destruyeron la economía, empobrecieron a la gente, sí, desde el año 70 hasta ahora el Estado se triplicó y multiplicaron por 6 el número de pobres, ¿sí? ¿Y sabes quiénes fueron los únicos que progresaron acá? Los políticos. Entonces, ¿saben qué? Quieren, digamos, quedarse en este país, ¿saben qué? Tienen que identificar el enemigo son los políticos. Hay que ir contra los políticos. Ellos son nuestros enemigos, ellos son los que nos hunden en la pobreza, ellos son los únicos que progresaron con este verso de la justicia social y la redistribución del ingreso. La verdadera redistribución del ingreso fue desde los que laburamos a los parásitos de los políticos. O sea, entonces no puede ser que en un país si le vaya mejor a los parásitos de la política que al tipo que produce.
Ultimately, Venezuela reminds us that hope never dies and that the struggle for freedom and justice is a permanent battle to advance and achieve a better quality of life. Therefore, it is crucial for the Venezuelan people and the international community to be vigilant and prepared to face any possible scenario and continue to fight for a democratic and prosperous future for the country and the entire region. The most important thing for resolving this complex situation is for all Venezuelans, we reiterate once again, to go out and vote on July 28th in these historic elections, exercising their democratic right and actively participating in building a much better future for their country, and continue to share their situation on social networks because it is the best strategy for international observation of the electoral process to be aware of everything, as external pressure is essential to guarantee the transparency and legitimacy of the results, challenging and rejecting any other attempt at manipulation by the government. If you liked our report, help us grow by subscribing to our channel and sharing the information on your social networks. You can also find us on Facebook as Leadership Latam, where we share information and read comments. Venezuelans, move forward. The future is yours.